The CEO laughed after slapping the quiet nurse. He stopped smiling when 3 Marine generals arrived. Conrad Bexley slapped her in front of everyone, and then he laughed. 1 second, Mara Kincaid was blocking the doorway of Trauma 1, telling the CEO of Rivergate that the Marine bleeding out on the table couldn't be moved. The next, his palm caught the side of her face, hard enough to knock her pen to the floor. Conrad straightened his cuffs, looked around at the frozen staff, and smiled like a man who had just proven a point. "You're a temp," he said. "You don't run anything in this building." Mara said nothing. She bent down, picked up her pen, turned back to her patient, and kept working. No trembling hands, no tears. Just that unreadable stillness that had made every nurse on the night shift quietly uncomfortable since the day she arrived. By sunrise, 3 Marine generals walked through the front doors in full uniform, and the only question they asked was who had touched Sparrow Six. Who exactly was Mara Kincaid? And what had Conrad Bexley just unleashed? If you're new here, this channel is where stories like this live. Stories about quiet people who turn out to be anything but. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Mara Kincaid arrived at Rivergate Trauma Center 40 minutes before her shift started. She always did. While the parking lot was still half empty and the fluorescent lights in the break room were humming over cold coffee, she moved through the emergency bay alone, checking each crash cart, counting the blood units in the refrigeration rack, running her fingers along the seal of every airway kit, as though she were reading something written there that no one else could see. The other nurses had stopped asking why she came in early. Some things after 3 years, you just accept. She had worked the night shift at Rivergate since arriving in Savannah, and in that time, she had given the staff almost nothing to go on. No family photos taped to her locker. No stories from wherever she'd been before. She deflected personal questions the way water deflects off glass, smoothly, completely leaving no trace that the question had ever landed. What she gave them instead was competence, so precise it occasionally made the attending physicians look slow. She could read internal bleeding from the color rising in a patient's face before the monitors caught it. She positioned herself in every room so that her back was never fully to a door. When a metal tray hit the floor one night and the sound cracked through the ward like a shot, her body dropped into a low crouch before her mind had processed anything at all. Joanne Pruitt, the charge nurse, with 30 years and no patience for pretense, had noticed all of it inside Mara's first month. She never said anything. Joanne had lived long enough to know that certain kinds of quiet weren't emptiness. They were pressure, held in by something stronger than words. She gave Mara her space, the way you give space to a structure you suspect is still load-bearing. 3 floors above the emergency department, Conrad Bexley was finishing a glass of sparkling water. In the event space, Rivergate had converted from a conference room into something that looked more like a hotel terrace. There were donors up there, the kind who wore watches worth more than some nurses' annual salaries, and Conrad moved among them with the ease of a man who had convinced himself that fundraising and medicine were essentially the same field. He spoke about compassion. He used the word excellence 4 times in 20 minutes. On the wall behind him, a rendering showed the new VIP treatment wing he was building. Private suites, concierge clinical staff rooms that looked nothing like hospital rooms because they were designed for people who didn't like being reminded they were mortal. Conrad had once been a physician. There was a photograph in his office, tucked behind a row of industry awards, of a much younger man in volunteer scrubs, standing outside a rural clinic in South Georgia, squinting into the sun and grinning. That man had believed things. He had driven 4 hours each way on weekends for a year to staff that clinic. Then a malpractice suit had taken the better part of 3 years and most of his savings. And something in him had quietly decided that idealism was a liability. He had moved into administration and never looked back. He never looked at the photograph either, but he hadn't thrown it away. That small fact said something, though Conrad himself couldn't have told you what. The largest donor in the room that night was Calder Rowe, built like a man who had worked on the docks before he owned them. The kind of wealthy that doesn't need to announce itself. Calder controlled a significant portion of cargo operations at the port of Savannah, and he had pledged tens of millions toward the VIP wing. Conrad kept him close all evening, laughing at his jokes, refilling his glass, treating him like the investment he was. What Conrad was not paying attention to, what he never paid attention to, was the emergency department 2 floors below running that night, with a skeleton crew in the middle of a coastal storm. The call came through at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. A military convoy had gone off a bridge on the coastal highway. Wet roads, 0 visibility, 1 vehicle over the railing. Rivergate would receive 3 casualties. 2 were stable enough for standard trauma bays. The 3rd was not. Sergeant Wade Talbot came through the bay doors on a gurney, moving fast, with 2 paramedics calling his vitals like they were reading a countdown. Blood pressure collapsing, labored breathing, multiple fractured ribs on the left side, probable internal hemorrhage. He was conscious, but barely, and his eyes moved with the glazed, recursive panic of a man whose body had decided it was somewhere else entirely. Mara had Trauma 1 cleared and prepped before the gurney cleared the threshold. She called for the massive transfusion protocol and pointed Dr. Wesley Trent, who had been staring at the incoming report with the particular stillness of someone in over their head, toward the ultrasound cart. Wesley was a good doctor in the way that a good student is a good student. Technically sound, methodical, under normal conditions, and deeply uncomfortable when normal conditions disappeared. He moved to the cart and began setting up. But his hands had a slight hesitation to them, a fraction of a second behind where they needed to be. Mara talked him through it without making it obvious that she was talking him through it, naming each step in a flat, calm voice that gave him something to follow. He followed it. It was in the middle of this, Wade's oxygen saturation climbing, the second IV line going in, the surgical team being paged, that Calder Rowe was pushed past on a gurney through the main corridor. He had felt chest tightness after leaving the event upstairs, and his assistant had called for the in-house team, who brought him down by private elevator. As the gurney rolled past the open doorway of Trauma 1, Calder turned his head and looked in. What he saw stopped him in a way chest pain hadn't. The room was controlled chaos, blood on the floor, monitors screaming numbers, a team of people working with the focused urgency of people who understood that minutes were not abstract. The man on the table was young, and he was a soldier, and there was a great deal of blood. Calder's face went through something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite recognition, but lived somewhere between the two. Nobody in the hallway noticed him looking. The gurney kept moving, and the door swung mostly closed behind it, and Calder said nothing. But he had seen. His preliminary numbers when they checked him were good. Blood pressure normal. EKG showing no acute changes. He needed observation and blood work, and time. He did not need Trauma 1. Conrad Bexley arrived anyway. He was still dressed from the event upstairs. Jacket buttoned, not a strand of hair out of place. Behind him came his assistant, a security officer, and the hospital's legal counsel. He walked with the unhurried certainty of a man entering a room he owned, which was technically accurate, and in every way that mattered, completely beside the point. He told Dr. Leonard Fisk, the trauma chief, that Trauma 1 needed to be cleared for Calder. The room was the most advanced in the department. It was private. It was away from the noise. Calder Rowe was the single largest financial contributor to this institution, and he deserved the best available space. Leonard said carefully that the patient currently in Trauma 1 could not be moved. A shift in position could destabilize the hemorrhage. It was not a preference. It was a clinical fact. Conrad said he appreciated the input. Then he said he wanted the room cleared in 10 minutes. Leonard went quiet. It was a specific kind of quiet, the kind that comes from years of making small accommodations. Years of telling yourself that keeping the department funded was a form of protecting patients, right up until the moment that logic ran out of road. He looked at the floor. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. Wesley found something that needed organizing near the supply rack. The two nurses near the station door suddenly needed to be somewhere else. Mara stepped into the doorway of Trauma 1. She wasn't blocking it dramatically. She was simply standing in it, watching Conrad with the same focused attention she gave to a blood pressure reading that didn't look right. She told him that Wade Talbot was being prioritized according to triage protocol. Mr. Rowe could receive full monitoring care in the adjacent bay. Moving the sergeant was not something she was going to do. If anyone wanted to issue that order, she said, they would need to put their name in the medical record and accept direct liability for whatever followed. The hallway went very still. Conrad understood immediately what she was doing. A documented order, his name, his decision. A soldier's death that was not a problem he could manage with a settlement agreement. His face shifted through several expressions in the span of a second, and what settled there wasn't anger exactly. It was something colder. The look of a man who had decided to remove an obstacle using whatever was fastest. He swung his hand, open palm full force the side of her face. The sound of it was flat and hard in the fluorescent quiet of the corridor. The edge of Mara's mask pulled free from one ear. Her head turned with the impact. A pen fell from her breast pocket and skittered across the tile. Nobody moved. From the monitoring bay at the far end of the corridor, through a narrow gap in the curtain that the staff had not fully drawn, Calder Rowe saw it happen. He saw Conrad's hand come across, and he saw Mara's head turn, and he saw Conrad look around at the frozen staff and smile. He saw the woman on the receiving end of that smile do nothing dramatic in response. Just turn back toward the room, bend at the knees, and pick up her pen. The expression on Calder's face in that moment was not one that would be easy to describe. It was the expression of a man who has just watched something be used in his name and cannot find a way to make that acceptable. Conrad told Mara she was suspended and told security to remove her from the department. He declared this loudly enough for everyone in the corridor to hear, and he looked around afterward, the way a man looks around when he expects applause. Then the monitors inside Trauma 1 changed pitch. Wade's blood pressure had dropped again, fast, the waveform spiking into the alarm range. His breathing had gone shallow and arrhythmic. Something in his chest was no longer stable. The alarm was continuous and loud, and the kind that does not leave room for any other consideration. Mara looked at Wade through the window. Then she walked back into the room. She told Wesley to check the left thoracic cavity, told the tech to have the cell saver ready, called the OR and said they needed to move in the next 20 minutes, or they wouldn't need to move at all. Wade had come back into partial consciousness. And the consciousness was wrong. Eyes wide, body pulling against the IV lines, chest heaving as though he could breathe his way out of a flooding vehicle. He got one hand around the side rail and tried to sit up. Mara caught him by the shoulder. She looked directly into his eyes, and when she spoke, something in her voice was different. Not louder, not softer, but structured in a way that cut through the noise like a frequency tuned for exactly this purpose. The coast is secured, she said. The exit route is clear. Follow my voice. Wade stopped fighting. He looked at her face the way you look at something you thought was gone. His grip on the bed rail loosened. His breathing found something closer to a rhythm. His eyes, still glassy, stayed locked on hers, and just before they closed again, his lips moved. "Sparrow 6, he whispered. "Commander Kincaid." Joanne heard it from the supply station. Wesley heard it from 2 feet away. The body camera clipped to Wade's shoulder strap, still transmitting, still recording, sending its signal automatically to a military server, because that was what it was built to do. Heard everything. In the corridor, Conrad was already on his phone, already telling someone to pull her file. He was still smiling. He had no way of knowing that the words a half-conscious Marine had just spoken were already moving through a system he had no access to, traveling toward 3 people who would not need to be asked twice. Wade Talbot made it to the operating room with 11 minutes to spare. Dr. Leonard Fisk, who had stood in the hallway and said nothing while Conrad Bexley issued an order that could have killed a patient, scrubbed in and did the work he was trained to do. The surgery took 4 hours. Wade came out alive. Leonard walked out of the OR and didn't speak to anyone for a long time. Conrad didn't wait for surgical outcomes. By 3:30 in the morning, he was already in the administrative wing with his legal team, building the version of events he intended the world to receive. The report his lawyers drafted described Mara Kincaid as an unstable employee who had exceeded her clinical authority, defied direct orders from hospital leadership, and disrupted the care of another patient in the process. The word erratic appeared twice. The phrase self-reported military background appeared once, positioned to sound like a fabrication. Conrad reviewed the language, suggested one change, and approved it. He also told the technology department to copy and then lock the emergency department's internal camera footage before anyone thought to request it. He said this quietly to one person in a hallway, and he said it the way a man says something he has said before, without hesitation, without drama, as though it were simply the next administrative step. What Conrad did not know was that Wade's body camera operated on a military transmission protocol entirely outside Rivergate's network. The moment the Convoy accident had been logged as a casualty event, the camera had begun pushing its data automatically to a secure server managed by the Corps. By the time Conrad's IT staff was locking the internal system, the footage, all of it, uncut, including Conrad's order to move a hemorrhaging patient, the sound of his hand across Mara's face, and his laughter afterward was already somewhere he couldn't reach. A duty officer reviewed the flag at 0400. The name in the audio transcript was classified, but recognizable to anyone who had worked in certain operational channels. 3 calls went out before 5 in the morning. The first reached Lieutenant General Abram Lockwood. The second reached Major General Lenora Finch. The third woke Brigadier General Tobias Crane, who listened to 12 seconds of audio, said nothing, and began getting dressed. Mara was sitting in her car in the Rivergate parking garage when her phone rang. She had not gone home. Some old instinct said, you don't leave until you know the situation is stable, even when the situation has made clear it no longer wants you there. The mark on her cheek had deepened to a bruise in the cold air. She hadn't looked at it. The caller was Silas Morrow. She knew his voice before he said his name, measured, unhurried. The voice of someone who had learned long ago that urgency and speed are not the same thing. He told her that 3 general officers were already en route to Savannah and had requested she remain accessible. He used the word requested the way people use it when they mean something closer to strongly advised. Mara told him she didn't need generals to manage a workplace incident. Silas said this had stopped being a workplace incident approximately 4 hours ago. Conrad had attempted to access her service record through a third-party political contact, and the query had triggered an automatic federal notification. More importantly, the footage from Wade's camera had been reviewed, and what it documented went beyond assault. It showed a hospital administrator ordering the relocation of an active trauma patient for non-clinical reasons, then obstructing the nurse attempting to prevent that patient's death. Given that Rivergate was under active consideration for a Department of Defense medical contract, the legal exposure was significant. Mara said she still didn't want generals walking in to fight her battles. "I know," Silas said, "but this isn't about you anymore. It might not have been about you for a while." She ended the call and sat in the concrete quiet of the parking garage, watching the rain move across the entrance ramp in thin silver curtains. When Mara's badge was deactivated as part of her suspension, it locked her out of every secured area in the building: stairwells, supply corridors, the recovery wing. Joanne had anticipated this. She left a service entrance propped open with a supply box and sent a text that said only, "Bay 4, he's asking." Mara came in the way she had learned to move through every space where she wasn't supposed to be. Quickly, quietly, aware of every exit. Wade looked smaller in the hospital bed than he had on the gurney, which was strange because on the gurney he had been nearly unconscious. He tracked her from the doorway with clear eyes. The eyes of someone who had been waiting and who had not been entirely sure she would come. He told her he had grown up listening to her voice. He said it plainly, without drama, the way you say something you've rehearsed, only because you've thought about it too many times. During his early training, the Corps had used a series of audio recordings to help Marines orient themselves under extreme stress drills, designed to simulate the cognitive distortion of injury and combat panic. The recordings were built around a specific vocal cadence that had been documented during a classified operation as unusually effective in pulling people back from the edge of shock. The voice in those recordings belonged to someone identified only as Sparrow 6. Wade had heard that voice so many times that when Mara spoke to him in Trauma 1, his brain had recognized it before the rest of him caught up. He told her what he knew of the story, the version that circulated among Marines who had come up through Raider training in the past decade. An isolated coastal facility, a unit cut off when their extraction route was destroyed. No helicopter, not enough blood. One medical officer, and whatever she could improvise. 32 Marines and 2 pilots kept alive through 11 hours by someone who refused to leave. He said the name Sparrow 6, the way young soldiers say the names of people they have never met but have built something onto. Not worship exactly, more like the particular respect you have for proof that the worst situation you can imagine has already been survived by someone who was just a person. Mara listened without moving. When he finished, she said, 7 people on my team didn't make it back. Wade said he knew. He said the Corps knew. He said that was exactly why they remembered her. Not because everything had gone right, but because she had stayed when leaving would have been easier, and had kept going when running out of options would have been enough excuse to stop. He looked at her directly and said the thing she had been running from for years. We don't remember you for the ones who died. We remember you for the ones who didn't. It was a simple sentence. It landed like something structural giving way, not collapsing, but shifting, settling into a new position. Mara looked at the monitor beside his bed for a long moment, then looked back at him and said nothing. There are things that don't need an answer. Sometimes an answer would just be a way of not letting the truth sit where it had finally landed. The edited video went public at noon. Conrad's communications team had clipped the footage carefully. What they released showed Mara re-entering Trauma 1 after being told to leave. Brisk, purposeful, ignoring the authority of hospital leadership. It showed her taking over a procedure without being invited to. It ended before anything useful happened to the patient. The segment showing Conrad's order to relocate a bleeding soldier his hand across her face, and his laughter was not included, because that footage was no longer in any system Conrad's team could access. The local news ran it with a chyron describing a suspended Rivergate nurse who defied administrative orders and disrupted patient care. By early afternoon, Mara's name was attached to the phrase "rogue nurse" in 2 separate broadcast segments, and Rivergate's communications office had issued a statement calling her conduct deeply concerning and currently under formal review. Joanne filed 2 documents within the hour. The first was a clinical counter-report stating that Mara's intervention had been appropriate, that the patient had been in acute crisis, and that the initial order to vacate Trauma 1 had come from non-clinical administrative personnel without grounds. The second was a formal assault complaint filed with the Savannah Police Department, listing her own name and the names of 6 staff members who had been present in the corridor and agreed to be named as witnesses. Conrad threatened her with termination before either document had finished printing. Joanne submitted both anyway and made 3 copies of each. Wesley Trent knew what the full video showed. He had been standing 2 feet from Mara when Conrad's hand connected with her face. He spent most of the afternoon walking the perimeter of a decision he couldn't quite bring himself to make, drafting a message to the legal department, deleting it, drafting it again. His residency, his board certification timeline, the attending position he was hoping to be offered in the spring. All of it sat on one side of the scale. On the other side was the knowledge of what he had seen and what his silence was currently helping to accomplish. He hadn't decided yet. He told himself he was still thinking. Conrad's legal team had uncovered the gap in Mara's personnel record by mid-afternoon 12 years, where the file went dark. Every field locked behind federal access credentials, a standing directive to report all queries to a designated oversight authority. They couldn't open it. They couldn't explain it. And the attempt to open it had already generated a notification that traveled to the same office Silas Morrow worked out of. Conrad understood abstractly that this might be a problem. He decided it wasn't one yet. He set up near the main entrance with his legal team by early evening and waited. When Mara appeared at the glass doors, the security officers moved to block her, and Conrad walked out to where she could see him, composed and almost pleasant. He offered her a settlement she would sign. A statement acknowledging that she had acted outside her authority and caused distress to hospital administration. She would issue a public apology. In exchange, Conrad would not pursue permanent revocation of her nursing license. He presented this as generosity. Mara looked at the document. She looked at his face. Then she tore the paper in half along the fold and let the pieces drop. Conrad's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. He nodded at the security officers. Mara stood her ground as 2 of them started toward her. And then the motion stopped, because something else was happening at the far end of the parking approach. A line of dark vehicles had turned in from the street, moving steadily and without hurry. They pulled up to the main entrance in a formation that was not accidental. The doors opened. 3 Marine generals stepped out in full dress uniform. The evening light caught the insignia on their collars and the ribbons on their chests, and for a moment, the entire entrance fell silent. Staff watching through the lobby glass, the security officers who had taken 2 steps toward Mara and then stopped. Conrad Bexley, who had been smiling, and now was not. Mara stood between the generals and the man who had struck her, and understood with complete clarity that the life she had built here, the anonymous, careful, low-profile life of a night shift nurse who didn't explain herself, was over. There was no version of what happened next that let her stay invisible. She had known this moment might come eventually. She had just assumed she'd have more warning. Lieutenant General Abram Lockwood walked through the front entrance of Rivergate Trauma Center, like a man who had walked into harder rooms and hadn't needed anyone to hold the door. Major General Lenora Finch came in beside him, and Brigadier General Tobias Crane came in last, and the three of them moved through the lobby with the particular stillness of people who do not need to signal authority because they have never had to. Behind them, Silas Morrow and two federal investigators followed at a pace that made clear this was not a courtesy visit. Conrad Bexley stepped forward. He had spent the better part of 30 years learning how to walk into a room and take it over. And he deployed that skill now, hand extended, expression calibrated to the specific warmth reserved for people who controlled large budgets. He said it was an honor. He said Rivergate was committed to its partnership with the Department of Defense. He said he looked forward to addressing any concerns directly. Nobody shook his hand. Lockwood looked past him, through him almost, and his voice carried across the lobby without effort. Lieutenant Commander Mara Kincaid. The lobby went quiet, in the way that lobbies go quiet when something is happening that everyone present understands is significant, even before they know why. Mara was standing near the security desk, and she answered from where she stood. She said she had separated from the service years ago. Lockwood said that her rank may have been inactive, but what she had done could not be separated from the institution that had trained her, and the Corps did not forget its own. Conrad tried to reinsert himself. He said Mara was a suspended employee under formal review, that she had violated hospital protocol and disrupted patient care, and that whatever her previous background, it had no bearing on an internal personnel matter. His voice had the practiced confidence of someone who had talked his way out of difficult rooms before. Tobias Crane took a step forward instead. He was not the largest man in the room, and he did not speak loudly, which somehow made everyone listen more carefully. He said that Mara had not self-reported military experience, as the hospital's press statement had suggested. She had served as the senior medical officer attached to a Marine Raider unit during a classified coastal operation, under conditions that most people in this lobby could not imagine, and would not survive. He did not say this to impress anyone. He said it because the record had been distorted, and he was correcting it. Then he looked down at his own left hand, and held it up, so the lobby could see the thin, lateral scar running across the palm. He told them he had been 19 hours into an operation when the extraction route was destroyed. He had a wound in his side that was going to kill him within the hour if nothing changed. There were no surgical instruments left that were useful for what needed to be done, and there was one medical officer who looked at the situation, looked at what she had, and used her bare hands to maintain pressure on the wound for nearly 40 minutes until the evacuation team arrived. He said the scar on his palm was from a piece of metal he had gripped to stay conscious while she worked. He said he had never forgotten the sound of her voice telling him to keep his eyes open. He said he was standing in this lobby because she had refused to make peace with the idea that he was going to die. The lobby was completely silent. A journalist near the far wall had stopped typing. Lenora Finch spoke next, more briefly. She confirmed that the stress orientation protocols currently used across multiple Marine units, the specific vocal cadence method for stabilizing personnel in acute psychological crisis, had been developed from field documentation of Mara's methods during that operation. What Wade Talbot had responded to in Trauma 1 the previous night was not a coincidence. He had been trained to respond to it. Thousands of service members had been trained to respond to it, using recordings that had been in the curriculum for years, attached to a name kept classified, because the person who owned it had asked for privacy and had earned the right to have that request honored. Conrad's legal counsel touched his arm and said something near his ear. Conrad shook the hand off. Lockwood told the audio-visual technician standing near the lobby display screen to pull up the footage from Wade Talbot's body camera. The complete, unedited file, which Silas Morrow's team had transferred to a secure tablet and brought with them. The technician looked at Conrad. Conrad said nothing. The technician looked at Lockwood, then at the tablet being held out by a federal investigator, and made a practical decision. The footage ran on the lobby screen for 4 minutes and 22 seconds. Everyone watched Conrad instruct staff to remove a hemorrhaging patient from a trauma room to accommodate a donor. Everyone heard Leonard Fisk attempt to object and then fall silent. Everyone saw the moment Conrad's hand came across Mara's face. The sound was audible through the speakers. And then everyone heard him laugh and tell the staff around him that a temp nurse didn't run anything in his building. When the footage ended, the silence it left behind had weight. Conrad said that context was important, that the clip didn't represent the full complexity of the administrative decision he had been trying to make, that the well-being of all patients had been his priority throughout. His voice had changed. The calibration was off. Something underneath the words was working too hard. Mara looked at him steadily and said, "You weren't wrong because you didn't know who I was. You were wrong because you believed you could hit someone when you thought no one powerful was standing behind them." Conrad opened his mouth and closed it. There was nothing in his professional vocabulary designed for this situation, because his professional vocabulary had been built on the assumption that he would always be the one defining the terms. It was at this moment that Calderon appeared at the edge of the lobby. He had been moved to an observation room off the main corridor earlier that evening, and had heard the footage through the wall, the audio carrying more clearly than anyone had anticipated. He was in a hospital gown, with a monitor lead still attached to his left wrist. A nurse following him with the cord, walking with the careful deliberateness of a man whose chest still ached, but who had decided the ache was not a reason to stay in the room. He looked at Conrad across the lobby, without any of the warmth their long donor relationship had produced. "You told me the room was needed for optimal patient flow," Calder said. "You used my name to justify moving a wounded soldier out of a trauma bay." He looked at the screen where the footage had played, and then back at Conrad. "I saw what happened in that hallway last night. I watched it happen from a gurney, and I didn't say anything. And that's something I'll have to account for. But I'm telling you now, you don't get to use my money for that. Not for any of that." Conrad started to respond. Calder said simply, "We're done," and allowed the nurse to guide him back toward the corridor. Lenora Finch announced that Rivergate's pending Department of Defense contract was suspended immediately, pending a full federal review. Preliminary data showed significant discrepancies between the staffing levels, blood reserve capacity, and trauma bed availability that Rivergate had certified to the DoD and what the department actually maintained. The gap was not clerical. Silas Morrow confirmed that Conrad was also under investigation for destruction of potential evidence, falsification of clinical capacity reports, and obstruction of a federal contractor review. The Savannah Police Department officer present, the one Joanne's formal assault complaint had set in motion that afternoon, approached to process the charge. When the officer moved toward Conrad, Mara told him to conduct the process correctly and away from the center of the lobby. The officer understood what she was asking and why, and moved Conrad toward a quieter area near the administrative wing. Conrad looked back at Mara as he walked. There was something in his expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not contrition exactly, but a kind of bewilderment. The look of a man encountering a logic he had no category for. She had just protected his dignity after he had publicly destroyed hers. That didn't compute for him. Mara said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I don't need you to feel small. I need you to understand that no one here is smaller than you." He had no answer for that. He walked with the officer, and Mara watched him go and then turned away. The months that followed moved at the pace investigations actually move, through documentation and depositions and institutional reviews that produce results in the language of policy rather than the language of justice. but they moved. Conrad was removed from his position within days and did not return. The board commissioned an independent audit. Wesley Trent submitted everything he had: emails, internal memos, notes he had kept on his personal phone, because some part of him had known, even in the middle of his silence, that silence had a cost. Mara required him to complete a formal ethics review and return to his residency under a supervised structure. She told him once and didn't repeat it. Capability could be taught, but judgment had to be practiced. And he had some practicing to do. Leonard Fisk made his accounting in a written statement that named his own failures specifically and without mitigation. He had believed that keeping the trauma department funded required accommodation, and accommodation had become a habit. And habits don't announce themselves as moral failures until the moment they finally are. Joanne was appointed to the newly created Patient Safety Board, the first time in Rivergate's history that nursing leadership held formal veto authority over administrative decisions with direct clinical impact. Wade recovered over several weeks. On the day he was cleared for transfer to a rehabilitation facility, he asked to see Mara one more time. She came, and he said what he had already said, but plainer. She had saved him twice, once in Trauma 1 and once a long time ago, in a recording he had listened to before he ever knew she was a real person. Mara told him the debt ran the other way. He had said her name out loud in a room full of people, and that had started everything that followed. She had spent years trying to keep that name buried, and it turned out the name had been doing useful work the entire time she was hiding it. The three generals offered her a senior advisory position within the military medical system. She declined. What she proposed instead was a program to be housed at Rivergate, a structured training initiative connecting civilian trauma staff with military medical protocols, focused on mass casualty response, combat stress orientation, ethical decision-making in crisis, and the specific question of what you do when the person giving orders is wrong. She called it the Coastal Trauma Bridge Initiative. She set 3 conditions no VIP designation could override emergency triage. Resources nursing staff would hold a formal seat in all clinical safety decisions, and every funding source would be disclosed publicly. Lockwood endorsed it. Finch allocated resources. Crane asked to participate in the inaugural session. 8 months later, the room that had housed Rivergate's donor lounge, the one with the terrace and the good lighting and the photographs of Conrad shaking hands with people who wrote large checks, was a simulation lab. The glass walls that had once surrounded fundraising dinners now enclosed training rooms, where doctors, nurses, paramedics, and young service members learned the same things in the same space. How to stay functional when the environment is trying to take you apart. How to see a patient as a person when the system is pressuring you to see them as a variable. And how to refuse an order that would cost someone their life, even when the person giving the order controls your paycheck. Mara taught there 3 days a week. She still arrived early. She still said less than most people expected. But the quality of her silence had changed. It no longer felt like something being held back. It felt like someone who had found the place where their history and their work were finally pulling in the same direction. One morning early, before the building filled, she stood in Trauma 1. The room was the same room, same walls, same light, same floor, where a pen had skittered across the tile in the middle of the night. The morning sun came through the exterior window at a low angle and fell across the floor in a way that had nothing dramatic about it. It was just light, doing what light does. A young nurse appeared in the doorway and asked her something she had been working up the courage to ask for weeks. How had Mara stayed so composed when Conrad hit her in front of everyone? With nowhere to go, Mara looked at the floor where the light was, and then at the young nurse and said, I wasn't quiet because I was afraid of him. I was quiet because there was someone dying on the other side of that door. She pulled on her gloves and walked into the room. There's something this story keeps coming back to. The idea that a person's value doesn't change based on who's standing behind them. Conrad only stopped smiling when the generals walked in. But Mara was worth protecting long before they arrived. So was every person in that hospital who'd been quietly overruled, underfunded, or told to look the other way. The people who keep the lights on in the hardest rooms aren't always the ones with the titles. Sometimes they're the ones who show up early, say less than you expect, and refuse to move when it matters. If that kind of story means something to you, stick around. There are more of them here. Subscribe if you haven't, and we'll see you in the next one.